Nicaragua is in the midst of its deadliest unrest since the country's civil war, which ended after decades of violence and instability in 1990. Hundreds have died amid government crackdowns on protests, calling for President Daniel Ortega to step down.
Y nos empezaron a disparar. No estaban en combate, no estaban peleando con nadie. Esperaron que pasara alguien para comenzarlo a rafaguear y me le dieron en la cabeza a mí.
Citizens, activists, and journalists alike are calling attention to the crisis, which they say has been vastly underreported by Western media. One of those people is Danay Vilches, a Nicaraguan journalist who has been covering the unrest in the streets since May. We spoke to her from the capital city of Managua, where much of the violence is taking place. She helped put into context just how bad things have gotten. I'm Alex, this is Now This World, and in light of the crisis in Nicaragua, we're asking, how did the country get here?
I've never seen something like this. So I think this is the most important thing that has happened in this country in the last 30 years.
The recent conflict started in mid-April 2018, when protesters descended on the capital, protesting the government's failure to address forest fires that burned through a protected region in the country. A couple days later, Ortega's government approved a plan that would slash pension payments and overhaul the social security system. New protests erupted over this plan and quickly evolved to reflect long-seated frustrations with the government. That's when pro-government groups started violently cracking down on protesters, leaving at least 25 people dead. Ortega rolled back the reforms just days after announcing them.
It was too late, and people were really mad. At that time, they didn't care about the reform anymore. They wanted Ortega to leave.
For many, the issue was bigger and more deeply rooted. It was about years of corruption, authoritarianism, and censorship. Ortega is in the midst of his third consecutive term as president and fourth term ever, something that wasn't allowed before 2014, when the National Assembly, comprised mostly of Ortega's party members, scrapped term limits. In fact, the ruling Sandinista National Liberation Front controls all branches of government, the army and police, and through threats of censorship and intimidation, pockets of the media. He even further consolidated power by instating his wife, Rosario Murillo, as vice president in 2016. Over the last 40 years, experts say Ortega's rule has transformed Nicaragua's democracy, and protesters agree.
They call him dictator all the time, but now they mostly call him a murderer. That's the word that they use, a murderer.
Ortega, who spent 7 years in prison for bank robbery, became president less than a decade after his release, and spent the following years consolidating power amid charges of electoral fraud and creeping authoritarianism. And recently, a drop in tourism and Ortega's overhaul of the social security system took Nicaragua from one of the fastest growing economies in Central America to suffering hundreds of millions of dollars in losses. People were ready for change. Over the last 2 months, those calling for Ortega to resign have been met with resistance from pro-government paramilitary forces.
You see the people with the mortars and the rocks trying to run from the bullets, and you see the paramilitaries with AK-47 and Dragunov or war guns, and it's a very unequal fight.
Amnesty International recently reported that Ortega's government is colluding with these armed groups and accusing the police of intentionally allowing perpetrators of violence to flee the scene. The order from the government, the report claims, is to, quote, shoot to kill. The government has denied any connection to or responsibility for the killings. Regional human rights group, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, has been tracking the violence and reports that more than 200 people have been killed and upwards of 1,000 people injured. They've denounced the government's excessive use of force, illegal detentions, censorship of the press, and, quote, other forms of intimidation, including the deaths of hundreds of demonstrators, as well as several police officers.
Esta lucha es una lucha del pueblo, y todo el pueblo tiene que unirse. No podemos ser indiferentes a que estén matando a nuestra gente, a nuestros niños.
A journalist was also killed while filming a Facebook Live.
I'm not gonna deny we feel fear. I've been running from bullets during this month that I've been here like twice. And yeah, you do feel the fear when you're in the streets that something might happen.
So what does the future look like for this country embroiled in crisis? There is reason for hope. Within the country, the Catholic Church has attempted several times to act as a peace broker between the two sides. getting as far in mid-June as a commitment to a ceasefire.
People don't believe in the Nicaraguan justice right now, but they do believe in international justice.
Although the ceasefire quickly dissolved, the church has stayed committed to calling for early elections to help put an end to the violence. A similar call has been repeated by some of the country's most powerful businessmen and the U.S. State Department. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights was granted access to investigate the violence, and even the UN has called for access. But Ortega has indicated that he does not plan to step down. Still, people hope that Ortega could face international persecution, even if he can't be brought to justice in his home country. Vilches says there's a general sense in the streets that the international community has forgotten Nicaragua. In a conflict with such high stakes, people are begging for the world to pay attention. So we want to hear from you. Is there something going on in your region that the international community has largely overlooked? Please let us know in the comments.